It started like any other day on my quiet little patch of Paradisia Ranch tucked peacefully on the outskirts of a suburban HOA development, far enough to enjoy silence, close enough to get the occasional HOA newsletter stuffed in my mailbox, which I usually toss straight into the burn barrel. But that morning, I stood frozen at the gate, a fat envelope from the HOA staring me down like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Inside were 87 printed parking violations, yes. 87, each one claiming I'd illegally parked a car on streets I'd never even driven on. At first, I thought it was a prank. I don't even own a car. My daily ride is a dusty old tractor and a pair of worn-out boots. No sidewalks, no parking lots, just acres of open land and hay bales. But each ticket came stamped with fines, court threats, and phrases like habitual violator in bold red ink, like I was some kind of serial parking felon. My hands shook as I flipped through them, feeling like I'd stepped into an alternate universe where common sense had packed its bags and skipped town. I'd lived peacefully for over a decade, never asked the HOA for a thing, and suddenly I was enemy number one for a ghost vehicle that didn't even exist. I could feel injustice crawling up my spine like fire ants, and I knew right then I was about to go to war over something I didn't even do. The deeper I dug into this nightmare, the clearer it became that something sinister was brewing beneath the surface. It turned out that, somehow, the HOA had redrawn property lines years ago quietly, behind closed doors, and without my consent. They'd included my ranch within their jurisdiction. No letter, no meeting, no vote, just a quiet legal maneuver rubber-stamped in a boardroom miles away from the dust of my driveway. That meant they thought they had authority over my land, even though my ranch had always been independently zoned and separate from the HOA neighborhood. They used this shady loophole to justify the fines, and when I challenged them on it, they threw their favorite weapon at me. You're in violation of community policy. What policy? I never signed one. I never agreed to be part of their little rulebook circus. But to them, it didn't matter. They treated my protests like background noise. My ranch, my independence, my peace of mind all were suddenly under threat by people I'd never met, never elected, and never wanted to deal with. It was like being pulled into a game I didn't agree to play, and the rules kept changing to make sure I lost. And what made it worse? They knew. They knew I didn't belong under their control, but they were counting on me being too tired, too isolated, too confused to fight back. Each fine was more ridiculous than the last. Vehicle obstructing sidewalk. I don't even have a sidewalk. Vehicle parked facing the wrong direction. What direction? North of the fence post and south of the goat. Abandoned car left overnight in a restricted zone. What car? The one in my imagination? These weren't just clerical errors. They were targeted attacks. I could feel it, like someone on that board had a grudge or, worse, was trying to make an example out of me. Maybe it was the fact that I never bowed to their authority, never paid their dues, never showed up to their meetings with brownies and compliments. Whatever it was, they'd chosen me. And when the final notice came, claiming that if I didn't pay the now tens of thousands in parking fines, they'd be placing a lien on my land, I almost choked on my coffee. A lien on my ranch for imaginary tickets tied to an imaginary car? That's when it stopped being frustrating and started being terrifying. That land wasn't just dirt, it was my home, my work, my freedom. And now it was under legal threat from a group of bureaucrats playing dictator with clipboards and petty vendettas. They weren't just stealing my time. They were coming for my legacy. I did what anyone would do when staring down an avalanche of nonsense. I tried to talk to them. I gathered every document. I had the deed to my ranch, the zoning maps, the fact that I didn't have a registered vehicle anywhere in the state. I showed up to their little office with a manila folder and the kind of calm that comes from being pushed too far. The receptionist wouldn't even look me in the eye. They sent out some middle management enforcer who offered me a cold bottle of water and a colder attitude. If you feel these citations are in error, he said with a smirk, you're welcome to file a formal dispute. As if I hadn't already. As if their system wasn't built to drag people through endless loops until they gave up. I asked him to explain how they could file tickets for a car I didn't own, parked on streets I never visited. His answer? That's what the records show. No investigation, just a smug deflection wrapped in legal jargon. They didn't care about the truth, they cared about compliance. And when they saw I wasn't folding, they doubled down: more fines, more threats, more pressure. They thought they could wear me down with paperwork and fear. What they didn't realize was that I'd rather lose everything than let someone walk all over me without a fight. The real twist came when I did what they never expected. I started doing my own research. I pulled public records, combed through the county archives, and that's when I found its smoking gun. All those tickets, they weren't from my address. They were for another man 2 blocks away, with a name just 1 letter off from mine. Somehow, in their system, our names had been crossed, and all his violations had been dumped on my file. The worst part? It wasn't even a secret. The original addresses were listed in the violation database. Anyone with half a brain could have spotted the error. But they didn't. Or worse, they did and chose not to fix it. I'd been dragged through hell because someone couldn't read properly, and rather than admit their mistake, the HOA buried me in bureaucracy. That discovery was my breaking point, but it was also my turning point. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for every person who'd ever been silenced by red tape, bullied by bureaucracy, or punished for someone else's mistake. They messed with the wrong cowboy, and now it was my turn to make them feel the heat. The moment I realized the entire fiasco was based on a simple, avoidable clerical error, I expected a wave of relief. What I got instead was a firestorm of disbelief and fury. You'd think that proving the tickets weren't mine, that the supposed violator lived blocks away, would be enough to put an end to the madness. But no. When I brought the evidence to the HOA board, they barely glanced at it. One woman actually had the nerve to say, "Well, it's already in the system," as if a lie becomes truth just because someone typed it into a database. They refused to retract the fines, claiming it wasn't their job to verify every complaint once it was processed. I stood there, holding printouts, maps, names, proof that I was being railroaded, and they looked at me like I was inconveniencing their afternoon. That's when it truly hit me. This wasn't about a mistake. This was about control, about preserving the illusion of their authority, even when it was built on a house of cards. They were more concerned with covering their own backs than correcting a mistake that had consumed nearly a year of my life. It made me wonder how many of my neighbors were silently suffering, buried in bogus violations, too tired or scared to speak up. I left that meeting not just determined to clear my name, I left ready to drag every dirty secret into the sunlight, no matter how deep it was buried. Word of my battle began to spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and that's when the real stories started pouring in. An elderly woman down the street had been fined for illegal pet waste, even though she didn't own a pet. A family who went away for a wedding came home to $600 in lawn care citations. Another man was forced to repaint his mailbox 3 times because the approved color kept changing. Suddenly, the pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't just making mistakes. They were weaponizing their power against anyone who didn't toe the line. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a culture of abuse, hidden behind neatly printed letters and phony professionalism. They thrived on silence, on isolation, on neighbors too scared to question the board for fear of retribution. But when I started talking, others found their voice too. One by one, people started bringing their complaints forward, and the HOA's iron grip began to tremble. What they hadn't counted on was that their obsession with control had turned them sloppy. They left a trail of inconsistencies, contradictions, and digital fingerprints that painted a picture of negligence and outright bullying. And suddenly, I wasn't just fighting for my own ranch, I was standing at the front of a movement, one voiced by dozens more, each of us tired of being treated like trespassers on our own land. The turning point came when I decided to stop playing defense. I hired a lawyer, someone smart, relentless, and just as angry about the misuse of authority as I was. Together, we filed suit against the HOA for defamation, abuse of power, and an illegal lien. The case wasn't just about parking tickets anymore. It was about the right to live without fear of being steamrolled by a faceless committee. The courtroom felt like a final showdown in a spaghetti western versus the board, truth versus bureaucracy, grit versus greed. We brought in testimony from neighbors, submitted piles of evidence, even highlighted the discrepancies in their own bylaws. I watched those board members squirm on the stand, suddenly unsure of the rules they claimed to uphold. Their polished smiles faded into flustered deflections when the judge asked why they continued to enforce a lien despite evidence of mistaken identity. They had no good answer, just a lot of shrugging, and to the best of our knowledge, nonsense. In that moment, the illusion shattered. The court saw it, the audience saw it, even the board members, deep down, saw it. When the judge ruled in my favor, ordering the lien removed and awarding damages for the stress, time, and legal fees they caused me, it wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning. That victory echoed beyond the courtroom walls. The judge forced the HOA to issue a public apology and refund every fine they'd wrongfully charged me. But more than that, it set off a chain reaction. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak out now had a precedent to stand on. The same board members who once ruled with fear were suddenly fielding resignations and emergency meetings. Reforms swept through the neighborhood like a cleansing fire. New bylaws were proposed, transparent, fair, and voted on by the entire community. We established a resident oversight committee, made sure no action could be taken without public disclosure, and rewrote the covenant to require homeowner consent before any jurisdictional changes could happen. I went from being the guy no one noticed to the guy people looked to when they needed help. And while I never wanted to be a hero, I realized that sometimes standing up for yourself gives others the courage to stand up too. That's the funny thing about injustice: it multiplies when ignored, but it crumbles when confronted. The pain they caused me became the seed of something stronger than they ever anticipated, a community that finally remembered its own power. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that silence is the sharpest tool in a bully's kit, and that speaking up even when it's hard, even when you feel alone, is the most powerful act of resistance. The HOA counted on my compliance, on my isolation, on me backing down to preserve peace. But peace that costs your dignity is nothing but quiet oppression. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, be it an HOA, a landlord, a boss, or anyone trying to push you into submission with red tape and fear and wait, document everything, ask questions, demand answers, and never stop until you're heard. Because these systems only thrive when we believe we're powerless. The truth is, most of the time, they're the ones afraid you'll pull back the curtain and show the world that the emperor has no clothes. My fight wasn't about a car. It wasn't even about a ranch. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice, refusing to let others dictate the terms of my freedom. And in the end, the biggest lesson I learned wasn't how to win against the HOA, it was how to never lose myself.